The high plains of Wyoming Territory in the year 1873 do not forgive. They do not remember. They offer nothing. No shelter, no shade, no softness. The grass runs flat to every horizon. The sky presses down like something heavy and indifferent. Wind moves through the sage and moves on. Nothing stays in this country unless it is strong enough to hold its ground. He rode through it the way water moves through stone. Not fast, not slow, just steady. His horse was a dark bay gelding, thick in the chest, short in the pastern, built for distance rather than speed. The animal moved with the same economy as its rider. No wasted motion, no dramatics. They had covered 90 miles in 2 days, and they would cover more before either of them rested. His coat was the color of dried creek mud. His hat was pulled low against a wind that came out of the northwest and did not apologize for the cold it carried. He rode with both hands visible, not as a statement, just habit. He almost missed the body. It lay in the low grass 50 yards east of a dry gulch, face down, arms extended in a way that meant the man had not fallen. He had been dropped. The stranger reined the gelding to a stop. He sat for a moment and looked at the surrounding country. No movement on the ridges, no dust rising from any direction. Whatever had happened here was finished. He dismounted. The man on the ground was Apache, younger than the stranger had first judged. He wore a cloth shirt, torn now and soaked dark at 3 separate points along his back and right shoulder. The wounds were not fresh. They were maybe 6 hours old. The blood had dried in places and seeped through in others. Someone had put 3 rounds into him and ridden on, confident in the count. They had been wrong. The stranger crouched beside the Apache and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck. The pulse was there, slow, thin, but there. He looked at the tracks. Shod horses, 4 of them, riding fast from the northwest and continuing southeast, toward a town. The tracks were clear in the soft ground near the gulch. The riders had not slowed. They had not looked back. This told the stranger what he needed to know about those men without having ever met them. He looked at the Apache again. He had no reason to stop here. He had no debt to this man. He had no knowledge of him, no connection, no obligation. The prairie offered its usual silence on the subject. He unslung his canteen from the saddle horn. He worked slowly. He rolled the Apache carefully onto his back and propped him using his saddlebag under the man's head and shoulders. 3 wounds. 1 through the meat of the right shoulder, clean. 1 below the left ribs, deep but not through the lung, judging by the breathing. 1 across the left thigh, the worst of them for blood loss but not for survival. He had seen men live through worse. He had seen men die from less. It depended on the man. He poured water against the Apache's lips. Most of it ran off. Some of it didn't. He built a fire in the gulch where it wouldn't be visible from the high ground. He used dried sage and a piece of hardwood he carried in his saddlebag for nights when wood was scarce. He boiled water in his tin cup. He cleaned the wounds with what he had. He used strips cut from his spare shirt as binding. The work was practiced and ungentle in its efficiency. He did not have the luxury of being gentle. Gentlemen worked in clean rooms with proper equipment. He worked in a dry gulch on the high plains of Wyoming with a dying stranger bleeding through borrowed cloth. He kept the fire small. He kept the rifle close. The Apache drifted in and out for the remainder of that day. The stranger sat near the fire and ate dried meat and watched the ridgelines. He slept in 2-hour intervals, waking at every sound, finding mostly wind and the distant movement of cattle somewhere to the south. The gelding stood picketed on good grass 20 feet up the gulch and showed no alarm through the night. By morning, the Apache's breathing had evened. By the second afternoon, he was conscious. He looked at the stranger the way a man looks at something he cannot yet categorize, not with gratitude, not with suspicion, but with a kind of precise attention. Reading, taking inventory. They had no common language that either was willing to attempt. The stranger offered water. The Apache drank. The stranger offered dried meat. The Apache looked at it, then at the stranger, then ate. On the 3rd day he stood, slowly. He walked the perimeter of the camp in a wide circle, testing each leg, checking each wound. He moved like a man reassessing his own machinery after a long interruption. He found it acceptable. He looked at the stranger's knife on the bedroll. He picked it up. He did not ask. He looked at the stranger once more, a long, level look that carried something in it the stranger understood without words. Then he walked to where the gelding stood, cut himself a strip of rawhide from a piece of tack the stranger would not miss, and bound the knife to his belt. He walked north. He did not look back. The stranger watched him until the figure disappeared into the grass. He felt nothing particular about the knife. he had another. He broke camp, kicked the ashes of the last fire apart until no heat remained, and mounted the gelding. He rode southeast, toward the tracks, toward Cutter's Creek. The town announced itself before it came into view. First the smell, coal smoke, raw timber, and something underneath both of those that was older and sourer. Then the sound of a stamp mill somewhere to the south, pounding ore with the regularity of a slow heart. Then the buildings themselves, cropping up against a low ridge in a way that suggested ambition without planning. Cutter's Creek had been built fast and built cheap, the way a place gets built when money appears suddenly and men know it won't last. He rode in on the main street at midday. There were perhaps 400 people in Cutter's Creek, or there had been once. The signs on the buildings told a story of a town that had been larger and more hopeful. 2 storefronts were boarded. The hotel had broken windows on the upper floor that had been covered with paper and then left. The livery was active. The saloon was active. Everything else looked like it was waiting for permission to give up. He noticed the homesteaders eating in the street outside the saloon. Not inside, outside. 2 families, children who ate without looking up. Women who kept their eyes on the food and their bodies positioned between the street and their children. Men who ate with one hand and kept the other free without quite knowing why they did it anymore. He tied the gelding in front of the saloon and went inside. The bartender was a wide man with the specific stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible while occupying a large body. He poured the whiskey without being asked and set it down without meeting the stranger's eyes. That was information. The stranger paid for the drink and stood at the bar and did not touch the glass. He looked at the room in the mirror behind the bar. 6 men, 2 playing cards near the window, not really playing, just keeping their hands busy. 3 at a table against the wall who were prior men by the cut of their coats and the particular ease with which they wore their guns. 1 alone near the back who looked like a man paid to be present rather than paid to think. The marshal's office was visible through the saloon window. The marshal came out once while the stranger stood at the bar. He walked to the edge of the boardwalk, looked up the street and down, and went back inside. He had not looked at the homesteaders eating 10 feet from his door. The Pryor brothers did not appear in person, but they did not need to. Their riders walked the main street at midday, 8 of them, moving in a loose group with the particular swagger of men who have never been told no in a place they intend to stay. They walked past the homesteaders. One of the riders said something. The stranger could not hear the words. He could see the effect. One of the homesteader men set down his food and looked at the ground. The stranger left the whiskey on the bar untouched and walked out. He read the situation the way he read most things, through its details. The water tower at the north end of town had a lock on it he had never seen on a water tower before. The creek for which the town was named was dammed at a point east of the main buildings, behind a fence with prior wire. The homestead plots he had passed riding in had crops that looked wrong for the season, not drought-stressed, but water-stressed. Being rationed, being controlled. A man who controls the water in a dry country controls the country. That was not complicated. What was complicated was being the man who decides to change it. He rented a room above the saloon and paid a week in advance. The bartender looked at the money for a moment before taking it, looking at it the way a man looks at something he is not certain is real. That night the stranger saddled the gelding and rode northwest. He had not been told about the Callaway farm. He had read it off the land, the set of the tracks, the spacing of the homestead plots, the specific direction prior riders patrolled as if they were watching something that needed watching. Sometimes a man who pays attention knows a thing before he is told it. The Callaway farm sat back from the creek behind a stand of cottonwoods. There was a lamp burning in the window. There was a barn. There were the sounds of livestock settling for the night. It was a farm that had survived several hard seasons on the strength of the people inside it, rather than on the generosity of the land. The riders came at 9:30. 8 horses moving without lanterns, which meant they had done this before and knew the way. They came from the south and the east in a loose arc, the way men come when they expect no resistance and plan to make noise rather than make war. They found the stranger in the dark between the barn and the cottonwoods. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not elaborate. The stranger did not make speeches. He did not negotiate. He had assessed 8 men and found 7 of them to be the kind of men who would stop when stopped firmly. The eighth required something more direct. By the end of those 4 minutes, one man stood in the yard holding a horse that was not his own, looking at his companions on the ground and understanding the specific mathematics of what had just occurred. The stranger stood in the lamplight from the farmhouse window. His voice was level and carried no more weight than it needed to. He said, "Ride back and tell the Priors the water rights belong to the people who settled here first." The rider looked at the men on the ground. He looked at the stranger. He mounted and rode. Eli Calloway came out of the farmhouse with a rifle and found 8 horses, 7 men on the ground in varying conditions, and a stranger already walking toward the cottonwoods. His wife stood in the doorway behind him with a lantern. The stranger did not stop to explain himself or accept their thanks. There was nothing to explain. What had been done had been done. He rode back to Cutter's Creek and slept 4 hours. The Priors sent 20 men at first light. If you want to see what happens when 20 guns ride into a town and find something they did not account for, stay right here. Because what those riders found when they reached Cutter's Creek changed the arithmetic of this story completely. The riders came in from the south at the break of dawn, 20 men in a column of 2s, armed and certain. They moved through the main street of Cutter's Creek with the confidence of men who have never had an equation change on them mid-problem. They were looking for one man. They expected to find one man. There are certain things that cannot be seen until they already surround you. The stranger stood in the center of the main street. He was alone on the ground. That part they had expected. What they had not expected was the ridge lines. To the north, the ridge above the water tower. To the east, the long ridge beyond the creek. To the south, the low ridge behind the stamp mill. To the west, the broken rock above the livery stable. On every ridge, still as the rock beneath them, 200 Apache warriors. Not moving, not shouting, not making any display at all. Simply present, simply watching. Their horses stood behind them on the reverse slopes. They had come in the night with a silence that left no tracks the prior riders had crossed without seeing. On the eastern ridge sat a warrior on a painted horse. He held no weapon in his hands. He needed none. The stranger had not sent for him. He had sent for nothing. He had made no signal, carried no message, arranged no alliance. What had happened in that dry gulch 3 days ago had been a private act, witnessed by no one, performed for no reason except that the man on the ground was still breathing, and the stranger had the means to help. That was the whole of it. What the warrior on the painted horse had done with those 3 days was his own business. He had ridden north. He had ridden fast. He had returned with 200 of his people, crossing 60 miles of high plains in darkness, arriving without announcement and taking positions on every ridge above a mining town in Wyoming territory in the year 1873. He had made no promise to do so. He had been asked for nothing. He came because a stranger had given him water when he was dying, and because in the code that governed his life, that act carried a weight that could not be ignored or diminished by distance or time. The 20 prior riders stopped their horses in the main street. They were professional men. They were not cowards. But cowardice had nothing to do with the calculation they performed in the next 30 seconds. 20 guns against one man is a manageable problem. 20 guns against one man and 200 warriors on every ridge above you is not a problem that gets managed. It is a problem that gets survived, if you read it correctly and move accordingly. The lead rider, a man named Cord, who had ridden for the Priors for 4 years and who was capable of genuine cruelty when the mathematics favored it, looked at the ridgelines for a long time. He looked at the stranger in the street. He looked at the warrior on the painted horse to the east. He turned his horse around without a word. 19 other men turned their horses around behind him. They rode south. In the saloon behind the window glass, the 3 Prior brothers watched. The eldest, a man named Harlan, had built this operation across 6 years of careful acquisition. He had bought water rights and land rights in the Marshals' cooperation. He had built a structure that worked by pressure and the credible threat of force. What he had not built, and what he had no structure to address, was 200 Apache warriors on the ridgelines above his town. He watched Cord ride south. He watched his 20 men follow. He stood at the window for a long time saying nothing. Then he turned to the marshal and said, "Get the paperwork." The marshal's hand shook when he wrote. He had been paid by the Priors for 3 years. He had been paid to look in other directions, to file certain things and not file other things, to be present at times and absent at others. It had been a comfortable arrangement. It was no longer comfortable. He wrote the water rights transfer as it was dictated, the creek rights, the tower rights, the easement across the northern sections, everything that had been used to put a slow squeeze on the homesteaders of Cutter's Creek for 2 years. Harlan Prior signed it. His brothers signed it. Their signatures were controlled, legible, the signatures of men accustomed to signing documents, and not of men whose hands shook. The marshal's signature was less legible than usual. The stranger stood in the doorway of the marshal's office. He did not enter the room. He watched the signing from the threshold with the patience of a man who has learned that most things will happen on their own time if given the correct conditions. When it was done, he walked out. By noon, the eastern ridge was empty. The northern ridge was empty. The southern and western ridges held nothing but rock and sage. The warriors had departed the way they had arrived, without announcement, leaving no ceremony behind them. Only the fact of what had happened remained, settling into the town like sediment into still water. The homesteaders came out into the main street at midday. Eli Calloway walked to the water tower and looked at the lock on it for a long time. Then he found a piece of iron and removed the lock and opened the tap at the base of the tower and watched the water come out. His wife stood next to him. His children stood behind her. They watched the water run into the dirt of the main street and said nothing for a while. By sundown, the stranger's room above the saloon was empty. The bartender found the key on the bar, set beside the whiskey that had never been touched. He looked at the glass for a long moment. Then he poured the whiskey out and washed the glass and put it away. No one in Cutter's Creek ever learned the stranger's name. They had not asked him for it. It had not seemed necessary in the moment, and afterward it seemed like the kind of thing that had already passed its window. The Pryor brothers left the territory within the month. Cord rode south and found work with another outfit in Texas, and did not speak of Cutter's Creek for the rest of his working life. The marshal resigned his post before anyone asked him to, and moved east. Eli Calloway's farm survived the following winter, and the winter after that. What the Pryor brothers never understood, and what perhaps would not have changed their choices even had they understood it, was where those 200 warriors had come from. They built their thinking around force and leverage and the reliability of paid men. They had no framework for what had happened on the eastern ridge. The warrior had come because of what the stranger did in a dry gulch when there was no witness and no advantage to be gained. Not because of a deal, not because of a promise, not because of anything that could be bought or threatened or arranged. He came because a stranger in the high plains had stopped when he had no reason to stop, had given water when he had no reason to give it, had dressed wounds and built a fire, and sat through 2 nights watching the ridge lines, so a man he did not know might have the chance to live. That is a thing that moves through the world on its own. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for acknowledgement. It simply moves, out through the grass and the wind and the distance between men who share no language and no history, and it arrives eventually at the moment it is needed. The stranger had understood something that most men spend their whole lives failing to learn. What you do when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, when the country is empty in every direction, and the easiest thing would be to ride on. That is the only true measure of a man. Not what he does in the saloon, not what he does in the marshal's office, what he does alone, on the high plains, with a dying stranger bleeding in the grass. That is who he is. That is everything. The gelding carried him north, away from Cutter's Creek, away from the ridgelines, away from signed papers and unlocked water towers and a marshal's shaking hand. The grass ran flat to every horizon. The sky pressed down. The wind came out of the northwest and moved on without stopping. He did not look back. What story do you want to hear next? Drop it in the comments.